On a quiet Idaho morning in 1992, Randy Weaver stood on his isolated mountaintop cabin, watching his family go about their day, unaware that within moments their lives would be forever altered by a deadly confrontation. Hidden among the dense pine trees, heavily armed federal agents silently surrounded the property, awaiting to arrest over a firearms violation. Without warning, shots shattered the peaceful morning air, leading to a tense standoff that would last days and leave deep emotional scars on the family. In the shootout, Weaver's wife Vicki and young son Sammy were both fatally shot. The Ruby Ridge incident became emblematic of the terrifying potential of government agency overreach, highlighting the catastrophic consequences when unchecked regulatory power collides violently with civilian life. Agencies such as the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, and state bodies like the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, were established to serve specific roles in national security, law enforcement, and resource management. Yet their expansive regulatory authority and absence of any oversight have led to significant abuses of power, as evidenced by infamous incidents including MKUltra, Ruby Ridge, and other controversial regulatory decisions impacting ordinary citizens. Addressing this unchecked power through increased transparency, oversight, and accountability is essential to preserving democratic governance and safeguarding our individual freedoms. Government agency overreach and unaccountability have been endemic to American history. For example, the CIA, established in 1947, is most infamous for programs such as MKUltra, a Cold War program where human rights were violated through conducting unethical tests of drugs on unsuspecting test subjects. Similar to the ATF, which was only originally charged with the regulation of alcohol and tobacco taxes, has over the years progressively assumed more authority until it ended with such high-profile disasters as the Ruby Ridge debacle of 1992, in which government aggression directly resulted in the deaths of citizens. Further state agencies, such as the FWC, wield tremendous regulatory authority with little to no public input. The FWC has even closed the red snapper fishery in Florida without releasing the research and reasoning behind their actions, yet selling permits to fish for them to only specific commercial fishermen. Evidence regarding these agencies records appalling patterns of unaccountability and power abuse. Organizations like the CIA and ATF have carried out operations that hurt individuals and violate their civil rights. But the participants in these events are rarely penalized. Victims of these violations have to go through lengthy court proceedings to receive any compensation at all. But the officials who carry out these operations rarely, if ever, face criminal sanctions. Moreover, regulatory bodies like the FWC and ATF can alter rules and regulations without congressional approval or public vote. This regulatory surplus allows them to enact decisions such as prohibition of guns or closure of fisheries that directly affect citizens' liberties and incomes. Despite the argument that such agencies that are operating under authority delegated by Congress and that their internal checks suffice, the lack of visible accountability tends to make it pretty distrustable. To dive further into this rabbit hole, I will first explain some of the necessary terms. The CIA was established in 1947 as a federal intelligence service responsible for gathering intelligence and carrying out other clandestine operations. The ATF regulates taxes and creates laws for firearms, explosives, and controlled substances. And finally, the FWC is a Florida state agency that regulates fish and wildlife in Florida, with many such other agencies in other states. Overreach by regulatory agencies occurs when agencies exceed their specified powers by creating or imposing regulations without significant legislative or public involvement. Inability to control these agencies is a grave issue with lasting implications. On the level of the individual, communities like fishermen and gun owners are directly harmed when agencies suddenly change rules without much reason. For example, the FWC's aforementioned closure of red snapper fisheries harmed recreational fishermen to the gain of commercial fishermen. On a broader level, incidents like MKUltra and Ruby Ridge are extremely damaging to public confidence in government agencies, generating distrust about what they plan and have the authority to do. This absence of accountability not only undermines our democratic values, but makes it easier to abuse power, disproportionately affecting those who do not have the resources to challenge these agencies. To correct these issues, several reforms are necessary. First, Agencies need to be compelled to increase transparency by releasing the research and rationale underlying their decisions. For example, the FWC needs to present scientific research before closing fisheries. Second, we need stronger oversight bodies such as independent review panels or increased congressional oversight. Third, there must be citizen involvement in the decision-making process, allowing for public voting or representation in cases involving citizens' rights. Fourth, criminal accountability must be used, ensuring that officials who have committed legal or unethical acts face legal sanctions. And finally, regulatory power needs to be curtailed, limiting the ability of these agencies to change laws or regulations without public or congressional approval. Implementing these reforms will help to start rebuilding public trust, protect our individual liberties, and allow for government agencies that operate within the Constitution's parameters. Government branches like the CIA and ATF, as they are now, have no way of answering to the people, and they also have the capacity to change regulations without asking Congress for a vote. They can alter laws without congressional or public consent, and this grants them complete control over the rights of citizens. Quote, "The delegation of rulemaking powers to administrative agencies often occurs without adequate democratic oversight." End quote. This has led to widespread abuses of power, some of which have culminated in human rights abuses, constitutional overreach, and attack on our civil liberties. It is necessary to establish avenues where these agencies are made accountable and restrained from single-handedly bringing forth rules impacting our rights. A major flaw of agencies like the CIA and ATF is that they have no accountability. These agencies have done egregious human rights and civil liberties abuses, but the people responsible for these incidents hardly ever face any criminal charges. A great example is MKUltra, a secret operation run by the CIA between the 1950s and 1970s, whose objective was to build mind-controlled systems via unethical practices on unsuspecting human beings. Its victims were drugged, interrogated, tortured, and mentally abused under the guise of national security. While these experiments were abhorrent, nobody was ever prosecuted. The only response to the incident was a congressional probe that verified that atrocities were committed, but did nothing to the perpetrators. Similarly, the ATF was quote-unquote held responsible for what transpired at Ruby Ridge when the shootout between federal officers and Randy Weaver killed his wife and son, but the government subsequently settled with the family, and the involved agents faced no more than disciplinary action. The absence of legal accountability for such incidents sends an unmistakable message. These agencies are above the law and outside of meaningful accountability. The Bible reminds us that God detests unequal weights and measures, Proverbs 11:1. When state power becomes arbitrary and unaccountable, it ceases to be just. The Waco siege mirrored this pattern of militarized response, questionable judgment, and loss of life, again with no real consequences. A congressional investigation into the incident found excessive force and questionable judgment in the initial raid and subsequent standoff at Waco. Survivors of Waco testified that government agents initiated the first shot, contrary to official accounts of the incident, and they also found that, quote, "The use of tear gas against civilians, such as women and children, was strongly condemned in the report," end quote. Moreover, the evidence that was destroyed or never collected, bringing the issue of transparency into question during the inquiry. All of the events demonstrated how federal agencies end up embracing militarized approaches with little or no accountability for the perpetrators. Quote, "The government's response at Waco brought to the forefront major concerns regarding the militarization of federal agencies," end quote. This is from the United States Congress Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, 1996 investigation into the Waco siege. The United States Patriot Act is yet another example of government overreach that directly impacts our civil liberties. Passed in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the act greatly enhanced the government's surveillance powers. Quote, "The Patriot Act grants law enforcement the incredible ability to snoop and search without the usual warrants," end quote. This act has been widely criticized for violating our Fourth Amendment right by granting officials a loophole around due process and wiretapping, data collection, and even searches of one's belongings. The justification for national security has been repeatedly used to support these constitutional infringements, but the exercise of these expanded powers is uncontrolled, and cases have found that these surveillance activities disproportionately affect American citizens, creating fears of the loss of privacy and unchecked governmental action. Another significant disadvantage of this unchecked agency power is its disproportionate effect on vulnerable populations. The Patriot Act surveillance activities have disproportionately affected racial minorities, political activists, and dissidents. Quote, studies have determined that government surveillance has disproportionate effects on communities of color and any engaged in political activism, end quote. This has raised concern that federal agencies are using their powers against certain groups and are going beyond traditional legal boundaries. The misuse of surveillance technology and data collection has further eroded public trust in government agencies. Government spending is yet another concern for these agencies. Billions of tax dollars are spent on intelligence and military operations without explicit controls. Quote, the allocation of federal funds is often opaque, leading to wasted resources and ineffective policies, end quote. In other cases, funds are allocated to foreign interventions and surveillance programs rather than domestic welfare, infrastructure, or education. The CIA and ATF have both experienced enormous budget expansions over the years, despite evidence of wasteful spending and mismanagement. Without checks and balances, these agencies keep siphoning public funds with no accountability for their budgetary decisions. Furthermore, government spending campaigns focus on defense contracts and corporate bailouts before the needs of the ordinary citizen. Quote, government agencies often work with private industry, producing conflicts of interest that compromise regulatory integrity, end quote. Corporate lobbying's domination of public agencies ensures that taxpayer dollars are often channeled into projects that profit large corporations rather than the common good. As a case point, defense contractors constantly win lucrative government contracts, even though we have no evident reason to justify additional military spending. Furthermore, the unchecked growth of the power of bureaucracy enables government agencies to implement policies that erode civil liberties. Quote, administrative agencies exercise quasi-legislative power with limited direct accountability to the public, end quote. The ability to establish and enforce rules of immediate democratic input bestows upon the agencies the power to shape public policy that may not be in the best interests of the citizens who they are commissioned to serve. The bodies such as the FWC and ATF enjoy robust powers to devise and enact rules without explicit popular approval. While such institutions do technically operate in line with the legislative blueprint, the susceptibility of exerting rules under no public ratification raises questions regarding the equality and accountability of this government control. The FWC manages Florida's wildlife and fisheries, and it does have the authority to enact rules of law, uncommon among most legislative agencies. The FWC can enact rules without elected officials' approval or direct vote by the people. This allows the Commission to enact hunting and fishing rules, gun regulations with regard to wildlife management, and habitat protection independent of public sentiment. Even though these regulations serve to conserve natural resources, they often generate controversy as they hit landowners, hunters, and outdoor recreationalists hard by taking them out of the decision process. Similarly, the ATF is also instrumental in regulating firearms, explosive, and alcohol-related bills on a national level. The ATF's authority allows it to enforce any existing laws and regulate them in such a way as to de facto enact new controls. For example, the agency has redefined certain firearms and gun accessories, such as bump stocks and pistol braces, effectively banning them without fresh congressional approval. This power enables the ATF to regulate gun ownership and production standards in a way that avoids the democratic process, sparking concerns about our Second Amendment rights. Both agencies claim their authority to make rules as cause of public safety and conservation, but without clear voter input, the legitimacy of their rules is questionable. While the people can subject rules to challenges in court or by legislation, the processes tend to be very slow and inefficient. This model allows for the possibility of unaffected officials imposing restraints that may not necessarily reflect the will of the people and can undermine our democratic values. In short, while the FWC and ATF are established to deal with specific regulatory matters, their ability to pass binding legislation without popular approval can lead to unjust outcomes. Public participation, transparency, and oversight are necessary to ensure that their actions actually adhere to democratic precepts and the rights of the people they represent. Measures such as increased government spending transparency, more regulatory checks, and enhanced whistleblower protection are crucial to bring about accountability. And without such safeguards, these agencies will continue their excessive powers, much to the detriment of our individual rights. Government agencies like the CIA and ATF are tasked with keeping the country safe, and enforcing law. That is a reality that cannot be altered, and despite my grievances with them, others would argue that it is untrue that they are not accountable. They are monitored by Congress, courts, and internal regulation checks to make sure that they do obey the law. And though mistakes have been made in the past, there have been reforms. Many do believe that they have control, that their rulemaking is somewhat warranted, and that they balance security with individual rights. The contention that the CIA and ATF are without accountability does not take into consideration that Congress and courts are in control of them. They are regulated by the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, which monitor the activities, budgets, and abuses of the agencies. Quote, Congress exercises a significant oversight over intelligence agencies to ensure they comply with the law and protect civil liberties, end quote. The ATF is a Department of Justice agency and is governed by the U.S. Attorney General. The decisions of the agency regarding alcohol, tobacco, and firearms are also reviewed after the fact by courts. If a rule is created by the ATF that is excessive, the courts should be able to stop it. Quote, judicial reviews serves an essential check on regulatory agencies preventing executive overreach, end quote. Therefore, in theory, these agents shouldn't have unbridled authority. However, I disagree. Although Congress and courts do technically supervise these agencies, the supervision is typically ineffective. Intelligence committees rely on the agencies to self-report for information and are thus guilty of conflict of interest and vagueness. There have also been numerous occasions where these agencies have provided false or misleading information to Congress during their investigations, such as the CIA's role in torture programs. Moreover, judicial review is not a strong check because courts are required to yield to executive agencies on matters of national security, which leaves a big gap for potential overreach. Another argument that people make is that agencies are falsely blamed for setting rules without the approval of the people, as Congress does delegate this power to them because they employ experts who can understand related issues. They argue that it would be challenging for Congress to monitor every detail of issues such as gun control, drug interdiction, and counterterrorism. The agencies must get approval of their suggested rules and defend their actions. Quote, the Administrative Procedure Act ensures public participation in rulemaking and transparency in the regulatory decisions, end quote. This guarantees that people are heard. To counter this argument, I would like to point out that despite agencies claiming that they make an effort to seek input from the public, the rulemaking process is still beyond the reach of the average citizen. Public hearings and comment periods for these rules are very difficult to attend, and even with them, agencies can proceed and issue regulations even though they are resisted by the majority of citizens. Their agendas can also lead to ambiguous language and regulations, allowing them to accrue more authority than was initially granted to them by Congress, resulting in executive overreach and lack of any actual democratic engagement. Something else other people with opposing viewpoints like to argue is that the government has learned from their past mistakes and instrumented regulatory changes. They argue that cases such as Ruby Ridge, the MKUltra experiments, and the Waco siege do illustrate agencies being vested with unregulated power, but they cause changes in the government workings that fix them. For instance, following the MKUltra exposure by the Church Committee, Congress enacted new legislation to limit the role of intelligence agencies. Quote, the Church Committee's inquiry on MKUltra resulted in enhanced intelligence activities oversight and higher ethical standards, end quote. The Ruby Ridge and Waco disasters also led to increased law enforcement training and stricter regulations on handling standoffs. These tragedies show that when mistakes happen, added safeguards are put in place. Although reforms have been implemented, I would argue that they are too lax to keep future abuses from happening. The post-Church Committee reforms, for example, did not stop later scandals such as warrantless wiretapping or drone strikes. Similarly, the increased training and improved rules following Waco and Ruby Ridge have not stopped controversial law enforcement activities such as Operation Fast and Furious, where the ATF lost guns intended to monitor criminal cartels. This means that mistakes are made repeatedly even when these reforms exist. People also argue that CIA and ATF do not run wild, as congressional supervision, judicial oversight, and internal codes check them. Past mistakes have led to reforms, and national security needs sometimes require instant action by experts. They argue that we should instead provide the openness and supervision for these agencies to do their jobs properly and not cut back on their ability. Accountability processes, including legislative oversight and judicial review, make agencies operate within the rule of the law. End quote. The balanced process ensures security as well as accountability, making the government agencies effective in serving the people, they argue. Even still, history has shown that the accountability for these agencies is never sufficient, and when there are violations, offenders are never held accountable in a real sense. For instance, the intelligence officials who deceived Congress about surveillance programs face no real consequences for lying. The threat of abuse remains, and until there are more serious consequences for the abuse of power, these agencies will be largely immune to accountability, as true accountability is not just oversight, but actual enforcement of law against those who abuse their power. In short, unchecked regulatory power in government agencies like the CIA, ATF, and FWC pose an ongoing threat to our democracy, our individual rights, and public trust. The historical record is clear. Without meaningful accountability, abuses such as MKUltra, Ruby Ridge, and inequitable regulatory actions will continue to reoccur, eroding the very foundations of our democratic government. To mitigate these dangers, comprehensive reforms must be enacted, prioritizing transparency, the establishment of robust and independent oversight mechanisms, enhanced citizen participation in the regulatory process, and strict enforcement of criminal accountability for agency misconduct. As concerned citizens, we can actively support accountability by staying informed about agency actions, participating in public comment periods, advocating for legislative reform, engaging with elected representatives to demand greater oversight, and voting for leaders committed to transparency and constitutional governance. Public trust can only be restored through visible, systematic changes that ensure government agencies operate within clearly defined boundaries and respond directly to the citizens they are tasked with serving. Ultimately, reinforcing these accountability measures will not only prevent future tragedies, but will also uphold and protect the constitutional liberties that are fundamental to our American democracy. Any questions?